sitting by in Cheyenne, Wyoming, I'm sure quite comfortably, is Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group, where she's now swimming in excess money because of massive budget cuts or something. Is that anywhere near true?
No.
No, okay. But let's lay this out for the people real quick. So I was watching on social media over the past couple of days. It's been all over the news in Wyoming that the governor has just decided to cut the budget massively. And when you look at the numbers, it sounds really big. But from what you've been telling me as you're passing me notes in class, is it's not really anywhere near what it should be. And why is that?
Yeah, so what the governor did on Tuesday was essentially before the Joint Appropriations Committee present an update on the revenues that they're expecting to generate for the 17-18 biennium. So you recall back in February the legislature got together, they made a new budget, and that was in 2016. That budget comes into effect on July 1st, 2016, and it really is for the fiscal 17-18 biennium. So essentially, in short, what they did back in February was decide what they were going to be spending for the next 2 years, based on revenue projections that were made the previous October. So what has happened, needless to say, is a few things in the minerals industry. You've probably heard about that up in Gillette. A few job losses.
Yeah, there's been some rumors out here and a few minor things like whole neighborhoods in foreclosure. But go ahead.
Yeah, so essentially they've got a new projection that his budget office put out that they're actually, for the 17-18 biennium, going to be short between $240 and $510 million. So what he had to do was figure out where he was going to make some savings. And what he did was essentially come out a few months ago with his 8% budget cut, essentially an across-the-board budget cut was what it was advertised as a couple of months ago. And what he did today was essentially present to the Joint Appropriations Committee what that was going to look like. And now, even though there was a range of between a $240 and $510 million shortfall for the next biennium, he decided to find $248 million in savings, which is about the 8% of the two-year general fund budget. Now, the two-year general fund budget is about $3 billion, so that's roughly 8% of that. But, of course, that's not all what the government spends. And this kind of goes back to 2012 when I wrote that whole bogus budget cut series.
Mm-hmm.
We've got people wringing their hands, oh my goodness, these cuts are draconian and all the rest of it. But in fact, in one department, the Department of Corrections, for example, they had to cut their budget by a draconian $17 million. That was done entirely by eliminating vacant positions. So it wasn't actually a cut. What it was a reduction in spending authority. And we saw quite a bit of that through the Joint Appropriations Committee meeting over the past couple of days.
Now, have you, and if you don't do this, I'll be happy to go to the Hallmark store and find the perfect card for you, but send a card to Governor Mead with all due love and respect that says politely, "I told you so."
Okay.
No?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
no. I mean, because still what we're seeing from the governor is a lot of trimming around the edges.
Yeah.
We're not seeing a reduction in the burden of government. Now, as I mentioned, we saw a lot of the elimination of jobs that weren't actually filled. So we're talking about defunding 300 positions, but we're only talking about laying off 7 people. So 7 people in government are going to lose their jobs. Now compare that to the 5,500 job losses in the minerals industry.
Right.
You can see here, if we don't start talking about fundamental reform, we're going to end up with a debt and higher taxes.
Here's a thought on that, though. You and I have had this conversation before where when you take the percentage of people in Wyoming that actually work for state government, we have one of the highest percentages in the country. Well, if we're losing people in the mineral industry, but then that has to translate into all the supporting industries outside of that, that means that percentage suddenly shifts upwards, even with the layoffs.
Well, I don't quite get what you mean, because
the number of people that are working for government in Wyoming as opposed to people in the private sector.
Well, that's true. Now, one of the things that there was a big headline about was that because of these draconian cuts, we're going to see 600 or almost 700 job losses in the private sector. That is entirely spin. Because what happens is that a lot of groups will lobby the government to fund those groups, and so they don't work directly for government, but they get what's called a government contract. So they get contracts to provide services in the community. They are still being paid from funds collected by taxpayers. One of the things Governor Mead says, well, gee, with this, it means we're going to be converting taxpayers to not taxpayers. But he did confess that this is net positive for the budget. Why? Because those people are not taxpayers. They are tax consumers. So what we have when we reduce contracts, government contracts for services in the community, is fewer tax consumers. Now, if those services that those groups are providing are truly valued, then people will either be willing to pay for them themselves, or they will be able to generate funds or collect funds from the private sector or from the charitable sector. Because when the government starts invading the charitable sector, what it essentially does is crowd out people's private funds and private donations. So once the government is gone from that area, we're going to see an increase in private donations for services that are truly valued.
Now, in all of what the governor has proposed, okay, so yeah, we're not going to fill some vacant positions, things like that. Was there anything actually that he was going to cut or shut down or suspend?
Well, as we have been talking about here at Wyoming Liberty Group, since the whole expansion of Medicaid discussion started up, was that once the cost of Medicaid starts to go up more and more and more, what happens is you get a reduction in reimbursements to providers, like doctors, say, for instance. And in fact, if you look at the budget cuts for the health department, the cuts to providers, so provider rate reduction, is actually $9.5 million in state funds and an equivalent $9.5 million reduction in federal funds. So you've got almost $20 million in reductions to payments to doctors and hospitals and that for Medicaid patients. Now, you know what's going to happen when that happens.
Yeah, and I've got to wonder, though, well, I keep looking at it thinking if we expand it, like it's still being talked about, then we end up with more people flooding into the state, which we can't afford either. So that ends up expanding the program that just causes more costs, not less. Am I wrong?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. But the issue, though, is that in order to cut costs, what happens in a sort of a single-payer or socialized healthcare system is that the costs that get cut are reimbursements to doctors. So what happens then over time is that people in Medicaid have more and more and more difficulty finding doctors. And in fact, somebody on the Joint Appropriations Committee asked that very question to Governor Mead. They said, well, if we reduce reimbursements to doctors, doesn't that mean it's going to be more difficult for Medicaid patients to find actual health care, to have access to health care? And he said, oh, yeah, there are these other states that have really low reimbursements, and it's really hard for Medicaid patients to find doctors. Yeah.
So why would he still want to do it? I was befuddled, really, that was even brought up as he was talking about finding ways to cut back on the budget and cut spending back. Any talk about raising taxes?
No, so far there's no talk about raising taxes, but what, of course, Governor Mead did want to try to do and did lament his inability to do was more rainy day fund raiding. Because ultimately what's going to happen is that there's such a strong feeling against raising taxes that at least until after the election, we're not going to see anybody talk about raising taxes. But what they are in fact doing is looking at all the different savings accounts. Because we've talked about savings accounts here on the show before. The state of Wyoming has literally hundreds of savings accounts. We've got roughly almost $20 billion in savings. Now, some of that is inviolate. that means that there has to be a constitutional amendment in order for the politicians to get their hands on it to spend. But a lot of it isn't. And so they're starting to review where is all that money, where they call them coffee cans. Where is all that money hidden away, and what can we access to keep on spending the way we've been spending before, which effectively is like a drunken sailor, because you've got this massive inflow of funds, revenue from the minerals industry, but that minerals industry revenue is gone. Yeah. They don't know when they're going to see it again. We did get a report from the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group member saying that essentially they had really overestimated the amount of revenue they thought they were going to get. Things could be much worse during the next legislative session. We're going to be looking at even more cuts, but if we don't start seeing some fundamental reform of government, in other words, getting rid of programs that government shouldn't be doing anyway, we're not going to see the kind of cuts and financial security for the future that we need to see.
Thursday edition, Bold Republic Radio Show. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group is standing by as we're going into great detail about how Governor Mead is explaining to committees in Cheyenne that we need to switch to single-ply toilet paper in government buildings and other such important budget cuts like that. I assume, Maureen, single-ply came up at some point.
I didn't hear that part.
Didn't hear that part. Okay. Well, you were sitting right behind the guy. So, yeah, well, okay. So if I mention WMD on this program, people think of weapons of mass destruction. This is far more destructive. WWMD, what would Maureen do? So if you're in charge of this, first off, did Governor Mead offer up anything that you approve of as far as cuts go?
He did briefly mention that the whole notion of this huge capital construction program that they have, that the government has, like hundreds of millions of dollars that are tied up in the government building buildings. And of course, we've got the big Taj Mahal construction down here in Cheyenne, the new capital reconstruction project. It's come under a huge amount of criticism, of course, because we get a lot of no-bid contracts, and it's already almost over budget. The cost keeps on creeping up, and they keep on dropping different parts of the project just to keep it under the line in the sand that the governor drew last summer of $300 million. So what the governor did hint around about slightly was dropping the Hirschler renovation. That would, at least a couple of months ago when they talked about how much it would save, that would save $50 million, probably a bit less than that now, but there's $50 million that the government could have to then utilize to try to reform government. And that's when we talk about using the rainy day fund here. I mean, we do have a lot of money saved up, but the big question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to keep the government status quo, or are we going to use that money to reform government? Because separation costs money. It costs money to break leases. It will cost money to shrink government down. Mm-hmm. So that's certainly something we could use the state savings for. But the last thing we should be thinking about is using state savings to fund the government status quo.
Okay, so you got 4 minutes here. So we're going to give you your wish list of things that you would like to see the state of Wyoming do in order to bring itself on budget or under budget. What would you cut?
Well, the new president of the University of Wyoming had some really, really good suggestions. And one of those was, for instance, they've got a bunch of faculty that work 51% of the time. They get paid 100% of their benefits. What she was saying is that either you're going to have somebody who's full-time that has 100% of the benefits, or they're going to be part-time and they're going to get no benefits. That's when she was up there talking, I thought, wow. I mean, you could see Senator Tony Ross. He was a bit shell-shocked because she's new. She's in there and she's saying, what we need to do is cut programs that nobody is using or that very few people use and have very, very low graduation rates. So she's talking about making the kinds of cuts that we need to see. What we need to see is government getting out of the things that people should be doing for themselves or people are doing for themselves. one of the things that has been done in a number of other states is something called the Yellow Pages test. So anything that you see in the Yellow Pages that government is doing, government needs to get out of doing because the private sector is doing it.
Right.
We need to get government to stop competing with the private sector and stop undermining the wealth-creating part of the economy and start reducing the wealth-destroying part of the economy, and that would be a really good place to start.
I would love to see, there's a project that the governor seems to be so proud of that would come up here to Campbell County, mainly Gillette, Wyoming. And, hey, let's get this carbon sequestration project going. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that is completely private sector.
Yeah, well, and the reason that, the oil and gas companies already do some of that themselves, there's no reason that the government should be essentially subsidizing that. And there's another really good area, and actually it's very low-hanging fruit that the government could get out of entirely, and that, of course, is corporate welfare. That's the provision of public funds for private benefit. Essentially, the public sector or the public or the taxpayer takes on a lot of risk and doesn't get the return that it should be getting. So corporate welfare is another thing that should go entirely.
Okay. I do have some concerns because it is necessary. I've been driving around the state a lot lately, and there are roads that are being fixed, but there's a lot of roads that still need to be fixed. And I worry as they start cutting things back, I look at some of those roads, and are we going to have money for that?
Well, here we had a really interesting example of government priorities here in Cheyenne a couple of weeks ago where on the Tuesday, the city council approved a 2.5% across-the-board pay increase for all city employees. And then on the Thursday, they said, oh, gee, we're not going to have enough money to fill the potholes.
Yeah.
So don't count on getting your road fixed. Count on very few government workers losing their jobs. Count on pay increases continuing for the government workers, but you're going to find that your potholes are not going to get fixed.
Wait, real quick, we got less than a minute here. So did the governor decide not to give his employees a raise?
Oh yeah, they got a raise, and he did talk about how giving raises is important. He said, I gave raises in my department, and they were justified and worthwhile. Yeah, I mean.
Okay.
Those are the priorities of these guys.
All right, Maureen, you're writing about this, of course, and people can follow you. So where do people find your work on this?
Definitely go to wyliberty.org. We've got our taxpayer protection pledge up there. Find out who your candidates are, and ask them if they've signed the pledge. If protecting your family's income is important to you, you really want to ensure that your candidates or the people that we elect are going to actually continue with this no tax increase or no new tax attitude that they seem to have now after the election is over.
Now's the time to do it. Maureen, as always, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here.
All right, Maureen Bader with Wyoming Liberty Group.